As we're already pressed for time, I'm introducing our last speaker. That's Professor Dr. Naomi Head. He's Professor of International Relations at the University of Glasgow in the UK, and her research and teaching focuses on narratives of conflict, the politics of empathy and emotions in war and conflict transformation. Naomi has a long-standing interest in mediation, communication, and forms of non-violence. Her work has engaged with conflicts in the Balkans, Israel and Palestine, the Iranian nuclear negotiations, and the coalition wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Hi, everybody. So thank you for the invitation to speak. My background is a little different, perhaps, from the medical focus that many in the room have. But really what I want to talk about today is the politics of emotions in terms of thinking about experiences of long COVID. And it links to many of the things that my colleagues have already raised in the session this morning. So emotions can either bring people together or keep people apart. They're essential in setting the boundaries of care, of group identities, for motivating the affective attachments that we have and creating a sense of belonging or indeed isolation and alienation. So emotions and affect shape polarization. In other words, who and what we feel for and with is shaped by these dynamics of belonging, of identity, of community that is structured by relations of power. Belonging, then, this construction of the moral and social bonds of political community that we have as human beings is always affectively constituted. Whether it's expressed through patriarchal institutions, for example, of church and family integral to conservatism, principles of mutual care and responsibility that underpin the welfare state, or other more radical and collective feminist, anarchic, socialist indigenous traditions, social and political orders can't function without affective relations and attachments. And so it is, I think, then, to think about how this may affect and function for those who may be marginalized from their communities through long COVID as a consequence of the breaking of those social connections through illness and the social and political responses to illness in our societies that we see. So when we think of our attitudes towards care as structuring of social relations, then I think the psychologization of long COVID has implications for the structural conditions of societal responses. So when attitudes towards care are shaped by beliefs and perceptions of stigma, of individual responsibility, of denial driven by fear and self-interest, this mobilizes affects towards patients in particular ways, as we've seen, representing them as weak, as responsible for their own illness, as a problem, as a drain on financial and other resources, and something crucially to be turned away from, not to be looked at. So actions of care then, such as masks, become visible objects through which our emotions are attached and circulated and reproduced. So visible representations of vulnerability, such as masks, reproduce these discourses and these feelings that are embodied in them towards others. So given this, then the question I want to ask is, how does this discourse of psychologization, I've been struggling to say that word in my head all morning, shape affective relations in order to perpetuate responses to long COVID that are grounded in relations of care, frequently expressed through fear, denial, anger, and stigma, as opposed to solidary relations of care expressed through love, hope, interdependency, and crucially, vulnerability. So I want to suggest then that this affective and political polarization, because indeed the affective polarization is always political, is enabled by the psychologization of long COVID because medical and societal responses have predominantly adopted a rationalist, masculinized, and quantified approach to care. In other words, a gendered approach to illness, medical misogyny, as others have pointed to, also reflects the emotions that are embedded in our politics of care. So what might a masculinized and rationalist approach to care look like, and how does it reveal affective assumptions at work? We see evidence for this in the speakers we've already heard today, in the medical advice to push through, to get a social life, not to be lazy, not to be malingering, to engage in graded physical activity despite evidence that demonstrates this leads to further harm. This reflects long-standing and highly gendered responses to pain, revealed by health data and by lived experiences of patients. It's reflected in the conservative and neoliberal antipathies to chronic illness and poor health that Viv was talking about a moment ago, as well as the threat posed by the potential of a subject who might not be all-knowing, agential, and autonomous. We see rationalism at work in the way in which illness is categorized as being all in the head, where medical practitioners can't understand or explain what is happening in biomedical terms. It's easier to attribute it to psychological reasons, which ultimately the patient has responsibility for. So this rationalist and masculinized approach to medicine, I think, makes it much harder for experts to admit that they might not know the answers or have uncertainty about how to proceed. This rationalist and masculinist approach to illness and care and the care it demands makes vulnerability visibly present, and I've said through the act of masking, something to be feared, to be scorned, mocked, turned away from. All of these are affective expressions that shape our politics of care. So the rejection of vulnerability then enables it to be something to target, with masking, testing, and other practices of care and crucially, of recognition of our interdependency becoming potential sites of a lack of care, of disbelief, and of hostility. So in wider societal context, then, I'm interested by the broader refusal to look at the implications of the pandemic and the ongoing experiences of COVID and long COVID. Why is there not, in other words, more collective empathy towards the knowledge and experiences of long COVID patients and the community they belong to? And so I want to turn to a very different source of a site of turning away, but one I think that can help us in thinking about the kinds of recognition at stake for long COVID. So I want to turn to the recent writing of Isabella Hamad in her work, Recognizing the Stranger. Now, Hamad was writing in relation to Palestine, but I think that there are parallels to unpick that may be useful and helpful to understand why it is so much easier to psychologize long COVID than it is to face the disease's complex reality and chronicity. Hamad argues that recognition of the stranger is akin to the shift from apparent blindness to staggering realization, to perceive something that you have known all along but did not want to know. So knowledge that we do not want to know, that we do not want to see, to become aware of. Hamad writes, and I quote, of individual moments of recognition being repeatedly overwhelmed by the energy of a political establishment that tells the onlooker, this is not what it looks like. It is too complicated to understand. Look away. Recognition for Hamad counters this looking away by something akin to an aha moment, in which someone has their own encounter, in her case with Palestinians and the occupation, in ways that remove the mask from their eyes and allows them to experience and to see, to know in an embodied and affective way, the consequences of the politics that we all live within. So in other words, Hamad talks of recognition in ways that ask us to see the humanity in others and to be curious about, to investigate the way in which ideology shapes our beliefs and our actions. So as Edward Said wrote in his 1984 essay, Permission to Narrate, and I quote Said, facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them. Such a narrative has to have a beginning and an end quote. So I think in the case of long COVID, then, we can see some parallels emerging. If the developing medical facts regarding the disease and the lived experiences of patients do not speak for themselves, as Said would argue, then what is the socially acceptable narrative that allows for a turning away, a preference for ignorance instead of knowledge, a refusal to recognize the reality of the disease, and the need to consider how we establish relations of care around it? What is the beginning and the end of such a narrative, and who has constructed it? What is the aha moment, the encounter that leads to recognition, to the acceptance of knowledge that is circulating despite our unwillingness to look at it? And how many people have to suffer for us to learn to look differently? What is it that people care about and are so attached to that the predominant affective choice is one of cognitive dismissal or denial, of fear, of mistrust, hostility, anger, and even aggression? And as Hamad asks in relation to Palestine, so too can we ask in relation to the impact of the pandemic. And I quote, in what ways are we mutilating ourselves when we dissociate to cope? What do we do, in other words, to ourselves and to our relations with others when we refuse to or cannot bear to look at the impacts and the consequences of the pandemic. So in other words, and to conclude, the forms of injustice that long COVID patients experience are not just medical, social, or epistemological, but they're also deeply affective. There is a form of affective injustice that is integral to these other dimensions of violence and injustice, because they essentially reflect the construction and the quality of our relations of care and interdependence. And I'll finish that. Thank you.